Hi, my name is Vanessa Rehkopf, and I did an action research study called Measuring the Effectiveness of Different Instructional Practices for Teaching Math Amongst the Mild Moderate Special Education Population. Students with disabilities in the education public sector are being serviced in three ways: inclusion, direct, which is a self-contained class, and consultative services. All schools across the globe have implemented initiatives to close the achievement gap within the special education population. Laws and requirements, such as Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, have required all school districts to have inclusive special education programs for students with disabilities. These requirements have allowed students with disabilities to have the right to a free, appropriate public education, despite their disability label, within their least restrictive environment. With that being said, the achievement gap among students with disabilities and their typically developing peers remains a concern. At the high school level, math is required all 4 years. Therefore, if a student falls behind, for example, fails 1 or 2 semesters, he or she has to attend summer school in order to regain the credit. Otherwise, they're automatically not going to graduate on time. Every year, students with disabilities make up a good portion of the summer school population, especially in the area of math. As of now, there is a significant lack of research of the flipped classroom and remote learning models, specifically for students with disabilities. The goal of this study is to determine a better way to meet the needs of these different types of learners. In the last 8 years of teaching math, depending on year to year, and sometimes unit to unit, students' levels of effort and attentiveness waver. I've tried to differentiate my teaching as much as possible to meet the needs of the learners in my classroom. After beginning this master's program at Bowling Green State University, I began to think about how I could incorporate technology to enhance the instruction and hopefully increase their math competency levels. I read multiple researches and benefits of the flipping the classroom and wanted to see how my students would react and be affected, especially since there is such a lack of research regarding the special education population. Because of COVID-19, I could no longer continue with the flipped classroom model, so I'm also including remote learning as more data points. Therefore, my purpose of the study was to determine which instructional strategy, traditional, flipped, or remote learning, is the most effective for students with mild to moderate disabilities pertaining to math. There are many benefits of flipping the classroom and remote learning. For example, students have more control. They can pause, rewind, and rewatch to ensure that they're hearing and understanding that everything that is being presented. It also promotes more student ownership. In traditional classrooms, students can easily be passive learners. But within the flipped learning model and remote learning, students have to transition into active learning. It helps also to resolve the issues around attendance. If a student is unable to come to school that day, then they're not actually missing the instruction because it's all recorded, and therefore it minimizes the loss of instruction for students. It also provides a bridge between teachers and parents. I hear all the time from parents that they do not understand the math that we're doing in class, or they do not know how to teach it in the way that their child is currently learning the material. With a flipped classroom model, parents have the ability to see what and how instruction is being given. And finally, it enables more flexibility. For the flipped classroom, teachers are able to work more with students one-on-one in small group learning during their normal classroom time. In the remote learning model, teachers are able to check in with students at different times depending on what best meets their needs. When I looked into this research, I really wanted to answer these 4 questions. Does using instructional videos result in a higher achievement scores? What do students feel are the benefits and drawbacks of using instructional videos? Which instructional strategy shows more effectiveness, the flipped classroom or remote learning? Which instructional strategy do students feel best meets their needs? The information from this research will allow intervention specialists to have a better understanding of effective strategies that meet the needs of the learners. In addition, this study provides students with a platform to voice their opinions and feel as though their education is being tailored to their specific needs. This study will focus on the effectiveness of instructional practices based on the data collection and findings. An analysis of results will allow the researcher to make suggestions for future teaching strategies, specifically focusing on high school math instruction for students with mild to moderate disabilities, in the hopes of improving their student performance. Purposive and convenient sampling was used in this study due to the specific qualifications of the desired subjects. All students were chosen because they met the following requirements: IEP services in direct or inclusion, and I have them on my roster so I could control what instruction was being provided. Here is a table where you can see the population of students broken down by gender, ethnicity, and where the students were receiving their services. Gender distribution was surprisingly unbalanced, but the ethnicity between Caucasian and minority was and the service location was more evenly distributed. Data for student achievement was and is being collected for two separate situations: flipped classroom and remote learning. The data for the flipped classroom was collected through open-ended math questions from chapter tests. The open-ended questions were used in order to provide students with the typical grading methods of partial credit using the math rubric developed by the math department at Worthington-Kilbourne High School. The data for the remote learning was collected through open-ended and multiple-choice math questions from Delta Math assessments. Delta Math scores student responses automatically by correct and incorrect. I have and will continue to monitor student answers and regrade using the rubric in order to maintain consistent grading between the two instructional models. The data collection for student perceptions will be through an online survey. Once all data is collected for the remote learning, the students will be sent an online survey. The first question will be multiple choice, and the next 3 questions will be open-ended for students to respond. The first question: which instructional model do you prefer? Traditional classroom learning, flipped classroom learning, or remote learning? The next 3 questions ask about the benefits and drawbacks of each of the types of models. In both types of services, direct and inclusion, students increased their average assessment scores for the flipped classroom model. In the traditional classroom learning, for direct services, students averaged 74.3%, where in the flipped model for those direct students, they reached an 80.2%. In the inclusion services for the traditional, they averaged a 70.7%. And then in the flipped classroom learning model, they increased their scores to 79.1%. So students who were in direct had a 5.9 increase percent in their average test scores. Their average scores went from a C to a B minus. Students who were in inclusion had an 8.4% increase in their average test scores. Their average scores increased from a C minus to a C plus. If you are a more visual person, here is a graph depicting the differences in assessment scores between the traditional classroom and the flipped classroom models. The direct data is on the left while the inclusion data is on the right. As you can see, in both serviced areas, scores increased using the flipped classroom model as shown by the green bars. Because of COVID-19, I could no longer do the flipped classroom model and had to switch to the remote learning in order to gain more data. With it only being the 3rd week of remote learning, I'm still currently collecting data. Once I've collected all the data from remote learning, I plan to send my students the survey questions that ask about the 3 models: traditional learning, flipped classroom, and remote learning. The research for this study is not yet finished due to the fact of the research of COVID-19 occurred. Therefore, my flipped classroom model focus has been derailed and I now needed to include more remote learning. The results that I've gathered thus far show that the flipped classroom model is more effective in increasing average assessment scores amongst the mild, moderate special education population. Once all the data is collected, I will be able to compare the results of the flipped classroom model and the remote classroom model in order to make conclusions about which one is more effective. In addition, once data is collected for the remote learning, I will then be able to send my students the survey questions that compare the benefits and drawbacks of each of the 3 models. The validity limitations are broken into 2 categories: internal and external. The internal revolves around accurate student responses. Students may not be providing their true feelings and select what they feel the teacher would want them to select. The external validity is due to the fact that the sample size of students was very small. Therefore, the results gained from this one study cannot be generalized to all similar situations. In the future, I would like to make 4 recommendations. First, I would like the study to focus solely on the flipped classroom model. While there was nothing that I could do about this current study due to COVID 19, my real interest is in the flipped classroom model. Remote learning in the public sector of education is not feasible nor desired. Secondly, I would like to have more assessment data. The data in this study was collected over 2 units. In order to make more accurate generalizations, collecting data over more units is needed, especially within a classroom such as mine. There we studied integrated math, and each unit can have more of a focus on algebra, but then the next unit could have more of a focus on geometry. An increase in sample size will show less weighted categories of data, thereby providing more accurate information. While this might not be possible within my role, that leads me to my final recommendation. Spreading the study to other schools and demographics will not only help the generalization of statistics, but also could help with the possible increase in a sample size depending on the school's population of students requiring specially designed instruction in math. Here are the references I used for my research of inclusion in direct services and blended learning focused on flipping the classroom. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation.